The Mayans were building cities in the jungle of Mesoamerica around 1,000 years before Christ. They had calendars, they had writing systems, they had priests who could predict eclipses. By the time they reached the height of their civilization, somewhere between 200 and 900 years after Christ, the world was already calling them ancient. But there were people living on Jamaica before the Mayans built their first pyramid. People who crossed open ocean to reach this island, who camped on its beaches, cracked its shellfish, carved its limestone, and buried their dead in its hills, centuries before a single stone was laid at Chichen Itza, or Tikal, or Palenque. They left no temples that the jungle swallowed. They left no writing that scholars are still arguing over. What they left was quieter than that, and in its own way, more disturbing. They left tools, they left bones. They left the ash of their fires pressed into the walls of caves that no one found until the 20th century. And in at least 2 cases, they left arrangements of stone and midden that no one has yet been able to explain in full. The Mayan comparison is not a metaphor. The radiocarbon dates from Jamaican shell middens go back to somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years before Christ. The earliest confirmed Mayan settlements in the lowlands of Belize and Guatemala are dated to around 2,000 years before Christ at the earliest, and the complex urban civilization that defines Mayan culture does not emerge until 500 to 300 years before Christ. Jamaica's Archaic Age population was living on this island during the same centuries. The Maya were still dispersed village farmers. The world does not know this. The guidebooks do not say it. The beach resorts on the north coast are built on the same coastal shelf where some of the earliest middens were deposited, and the guests who lie on those beaches have no idea they are resting above one of the earliest known human occupation sites in the Caribbean basin. This is what lies beneath Jamaica, and almost none of it has been fully excavated. If that is the kind of record you want to follow one site at a time, the subscribe button is there before we go any further. This channel is where the Caribbean's buried history gets counted. The first thing to understand is what archaic means in this context, because the word gets misused and the misuse matters. In Caribbean archaeology, the Archaic Age refers to the period before the introduction of pottery, before clay vessels, before the agricultural villages and the ceremonial plazas and the carved zemis that define what most people think of as pre-Columbian Caribbean culture. The people of the Archaic Age worked stone and shell and bone. They foraged and they fished. They moved between camps on a seasonal cycle, following the shellfish beds and the turtle nesting grounds and the migratory birds. This description tends to produce a mental image of primitive wanderers, which is both inaccurate and condescending. People who cross open ocean in watercraft they built themselves are not primitive. They had navigational knowledge precise enough to find a small island in a wide sea. They had tool technology sophisticated enough to process hard materials without metal. They had social structures capable of organizing the crossing, the landing, and the sustained occupation of a new environment. What they did not have was pottery. And in the archaeological record, the absence of pottery is the absence of everything pottery implies about settled, stratified society. No pottery means no grain storage vessels, which suggests a foraging economy rather than an agricultural one. No pottery means no cooking pots, which shapes the entire diet and the way people process and share food. The absence tells you more than the absence alone would suggest. The Archaic Age in the Caribbean is now understood to have begun significantly earlier than scholars once believed. For most of the 20th century, the consensus held that the Caribbean islands were first settled by ceramic-using, agriculturally organized peoples, the ancestors of the Taino, who moved north and east from the South American mainland through the Lesser Antilles. The archaic populations were acknowledged but underemphasized, treated as brief precursors who left little trace. The excavations of the 1980s through the 2000s changed that picture. Jamaica, in particular, produced dates that pushed the arrival of the first Jamaicans back much further than the model had predicted. The site that changed the conversation for Jamaica sits on the southern coast, near the town of Little River in St. Elizabeth Parish. The site is called Little River, and the name tells you almost nothing about what was found there, which is part of the problem. Caribbean archaeology works with a naming convention that emphasizes geography over significance, and Little River sounds like a footnote when it is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most important archaic sites in the entire island chain. What the excavations recovered there, along with associated sites in the same coastal zone, were shell middens dated by radiocarbon analysis to the 2nd millennium before Christ. The shellfish were collected, consumed, and discarded by people who were living in coastal camps on the south shore of Jamaica, at a time when the island was essentially the western edge of the known world for the peoples moving through this ocean. Shell middens are not glamorous. They do not produce the kind of photographs that end up on museum exhibition banners. A midden is, at its most basic, a trash heap. Broken shell, animal bone, fire-cracked stone from a hearth. But what a midden contains is a precise and datable record of what people ate, where they went, and roughly when they were there. The shellfish species tell you what coastal environment those people were exploiting. The ratio of terrestrial to marine fauna tells you how much time they spent inland versus on the coast. The charcoal from the hearth gives you the date, at Little River, and at related sites across the southern coastal parish of St. Elizabeth and into Clarendon, the dates were consistent and old. Old enough to place the first Jamaicans in the same era as the early Bronze Age cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean. Old enough to overlap with the construction of Stonehenge. Old enough to predate the Olmec civilization of Mexico, which is itself considered one of the mother cultures of all subsequent Mesoamerican civilization, including the Maya. The Olmec emerged around 1500 years before Christ. The people on Jamaica's south coast were there before them. The tools they left are harder to read than the middens, but they carry their own record. The stone tools recovered from Jamaican archaic sites belong to what archaeologists call a lithic technology, which means they were made by knapping and grinding stone rather than by casting or smelting metal. The tool assemblages are dominated by choppers, scrapers, and grinding stones. Choppers for processing hard organic material, scrapers for working hide or fish. Grinding stones for processing plant material, which tells you that these people were not exclusively carnivorous coastal foragers, but were also exploiting the island's interior plant resources. This last point matters because it complicates the older model of the archaic Caribbean population as purely coastal. If they were grinding plant material, they were going inland to get it. If they were going inland, they were moving through the same limestone interior that defines Jamaica's central geography, the same karst hills and river valleys and cave systems that still cover much of the parish interior today. Whether they used the caves as shelters, or as ceremonial sites, or simply as landmarks in their seasonal movements, is not fully established. What is established is that some caves in the Jamaican interior contain evidence of human presence that predates the Taino occupation by enough of a margin to suggest archaic rather than ceramic age use. One of those caves sits in the Hellshire Hills of St. Catherine. The shell and bone material in the deeper deposits of the cave system produce dates that some researchers have placed in the Archaic period. No full excavation of those deeper deposits has ever been published. The cave is officially closed, the signs are still up, and the bone and shell in the lower chambers have never been brought to light. The comparison to the Maya is worth holding on to a little longer, because it is not simply a matter of dates. It is a matter of what those dates mean for how we understand the development of complex society in the Americas. The Maya are understood as the product of a long, slow cultural development that began with early village farming in the lowlands of what is now Mexico and Guatemala, and culminated in the classic period cities of Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and Chichen Itza. That development took roughly 2,000 years from the first farming villages to the carved inscriptions on the stelae that scholars spent the 20th century deciphering. The archaic people of Jamaica had no agriculture. They had no monumental construction. They had no writing. By the metrics the academic world typically uses to measure civilizational complexity, they score low. But those metrics were developed primarily to describe the Eurasian and Mesoamerican cultural sequences, and they fit poorly when applied to peoples whose mode of existence was not centered on sedentary agriculture. A coastal foraging people who can navigate open ocean, maintain a population across centuries on a small island, and pass their knowledge down through enough generations to produce a continuous occupation for more than a millennium. That is not a simple society. It is a society with a different relationship to complexity. The complexity is in the navigation. It is in the knowledge of which shellfish beds peak in which seasons. It is in the oral transmission of everything the community knows with no writing to hold it. When the radiocarbon dates from Jamaica's southern coast push back to 2,000 or 3,000 years before Christ, what they are recording is not a footnote to the story of the Maya. They are recording a parallel human achievement, quieter and harder to read, but no less real. The question of who the archaic Jamaicans were and where they came from is not settled, but the current evidence points toward two possible sources. The first is South America, specifically the coast of Venezuela and the Orinoco Basin. The second is Central America, specifically the coastal zones of Honduras and Belize. The South American hypothesis is the older and more widely accepted. It follows the same general migration pathway that brought the ceramic-using ancestors of the Taino into the Caribbean from the Orinoco region, but places an earlier, pre-ceramic wave ahead of them. The Central American hypothesis draws on the geography of the Western Caribbean, where Jamaica sits at a natural crossing point between the Central American coast and the islands of the Greater Antilles. The currents and the prevailing winds in this part of the Caribbean make a direct crossing from the Honduran or Belizean coast to Jamaica, plausible in a dugout canoe or a reed raft of sufficient size. The toolkits recovered from Jamaican archaic sites share characteristics with both traditions. The grinding stones and shell-working tools have parallels in Venezuela. The way some of the stone choppers were prepared has been compared to Central American lithic traditions. The honest answer, as of the most recent published research, is that the question of origin is still open, and that the Caribbean Archaic may represent not one migration, but several, along different routes at different times. What no one disputes is that the people who occupied Jamaica in the Archaic period were there first, before the Taino, before any ceramic tradition entered the island. The ground they walked is still Jamaica's ground, and the sites where they camped are still in the soil beneath the parishes. The Taino arrival does not erase the archaic record, but it does complicate it. When the ceramic-using, agriculturally organized ancestors of the Taino moved into Jamaica, sometime in the first millennium after Christ, they encountered a landscape that had already been occupied for somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years. What happened at that contact point is one of the genuinely open questions of Caribbean prehistory. The possibilities run from peaceful coexistence and eventual absorption to competitive displacement. The evidence does not clearly support one scenario over the other. What the evidence does show is that the archaic sites on the southern coast of Jamaica largely ceased to produce new material around the same period that Taino ceramic material begins to appear in the island's archaeological record. That coincidence of timing is either meaningful or it is not, and no one has yet produced a dataset large enough or carefully enough excavated to distinguish between the two. There is one site in particular that has attracted attention in this regard. The White Marl site in St. Catherine, the largest and most extensively organized pre-colonial site documented in Jamaica, sits on a hilltop above the Rio Cobre River. The occupation there is primarily Taino and is dated between roughly 900 and 1500 years after Christ. But some of the material in the deeper deposits at White Marl has been interpreted as evidence of earlier, possibly archaic use of the same hilltop. If that interpretation holds, it would mean that the Taino settled White Marl on ground the archaic peoples had already used before them, that the hilltop position, the river access, the sightlines across the surrounding country, made it a good location regardless of what century you were doing the camping in. The full excavation that would confirm or disprove this has never been completed. The Mandela Highway runs through part of the site. The road is still there. The deeper deposits are still in the hill. One of the more striking things the archaic record preserves is the diet, and the diet tells a story about the island itself that the island no longer tells. The bone assemblages and the midden contents from Jamaica's archaic sites show a fauna that no longer exists on the island in its original form. The large land mammals that the first Jamaicans were hunting and eating, including several species of giant ground sloth and a large endemic rodent called Clytomys, were extinct on the island by the time the Taino arrived. Whether the archaic peoples hunted these animals to extinction, or whether climate and habitat change drove the extinctions, is a question the fossil record has not fully resolved. What the middens show is that in the period of the earliest Jamaican occupation, there were large terrestrial mammals available as food resources that are simply not there anymore. The island the first Jamaicans arrived on was ecologically different from the island the Spanish found in 1494. The archaic peoples experienced a Jamaica that the Taino had never known. The giant sloths in particular were significant prey. They were slow, large, and apparently not naturally afraid of humans, which made them easy to hunt and quickly vulnerable to overexploitation by even a small population of efficient hunters. The same pattern of megafaunal extinction following human arrival is documented across the Pacific and in the Americas more broadly. Jamaica fits the pattern. The last of these animals died on Jamaica somewhere in the second millennium before Christ, which aligns with the period of sustained archaic occupation of the southern coast. The animals are gone. The bones are in the middens. The middens are still in the ground. The cave record is perhaps the most tantalizing part of what the archaic period left behind, and it is the least excavated. Jamaica is a limestone island, which means it is an island riddled with caves. Hundreds of cave systems have been recorded. The majority have never been formally surveyed. A significant number show evidence of human use that predates any ceramic material, which is the signature of Archaic rather than Taino activity. The problem with cave sites in Jamaica is access. The island's karst interior is difficult terrain. Many of the relevant cave systems sit in areas with no road access, in parishes where the local community has its own relationship to the caves that does not align with formal archaeological survey. The Duppy tradition in Jamaica assigns significant spiritual meaning to many cave systems, and that meaning is taken seriously by the communities who live near them. These are not obstacles to archaeology so much as obligations that responsible archaeology has to navigate carefully. What the surveyed cave sites in Jamaica show is a clear pattern. Cave systems that were later used by the Taino for ceremony or burial frequently show evidence of prior use in their outer chambers or approach areas, material that on stratigraphic or radiocarbon grounds predates the Taino occupation. The Taino were not moving into empty space when they adopted these caves as ritual sites. They were entering spaces that already had a human history. What the archaic peoples were doing in those caves, whether sheltering, processing food, or conducting ceremonies of their own kind, is not established by the current evidence. The material they left is functional rather than symbolic, which either means they did not use caves for symbolic purposes, or it means the symbolic material they used was organic and has not survived. The bone deposits recovered from Jamaican archaic contexts carry a kind of information that researchers have only recently begun to analyze with the full range of available tools. The study of ancient DNA from human remains is a relatively recent development, and its application to Caribbean prehistory is more recent still. The results from the first round of Caribbean ancient DNA studies, published between 2015 and 2023, substantially revised the older model of Caribbean population history. What the ancient DNA showed, broadly, is that the archaic populations of the Caribbean were not a single homogeneous group. There appear to have been at least two genetically distinct archaic traditions present in the islands, one with closer affinities to South American populations, and one with connections to Central or North American populations. The samples from Jamaica are few. The preservation conditions in a tropical limestone island are not kind to ancient organic material, but the samples that have been analyzed show genetic profiles consistent with the South American archaic tradition. The ancient DNA studies also addressed what happened to the archaic peoples when the ceramic-using Taino ancestors arrived. The genetic signal in the later Taino populations of the Greater Antilles does not show a clean replacement of one population by another. It shows a mixture. The archaic genetic contribution is present in Taino period samples, which means the contact between these two groups was not a simple displacement. Some of the archaic people survived. Some merged with the incoming ceramic population. Something of who they were passed forward into the Taino and, through the Taino, into the island's later history. That genetic thread still runs through the people of Jamaica today, 3,000 years after the first canoe pulled onto its southern shore. The Spanish arrived at Jamaica in 1494 and spent the next few decades doing what colonial powers do to the places they encounter. They disrupted, displaced, and ultimately destroyed the indigenous population and the cultural record it carried. By the time the English took the island in 1655, the Taino were effectively gone, and the archaic peoples who had preceded them had been gone for at least a millennium before that. What the Spanish and then the English found were physical remains they did not know how to read. The stone structures at Sevilla Nueva, the carved figures in the caves, the middens that showed up when they broke ground. All of it was either ignored or misidentified or shipped to Europe as curiosities. The Spanish did not understand that they were building their first Jamaican capital on top of a Taino village that was itself built on top of an archaic campsite. The layering went unread. The carved stones at Sevilla Nueva, which the Spanish left incomplete when they abandoned the settlement in 1534, include iconographic elements that scholars are still arguing over. Some of the imagery is European grotesque. Some of it is Taino, carved by Taino or African hands under Spanish direction. But some of the imagery, particularly in the deeper carved surfaces, does not fit cleanly into either tradition. The argument is not settled, and beneath the Spanish level, beneath the Taino level, the archaic deposits that no one has yet reached in any complete fashion are still in the ground. The island of Jamaica sits at the western end of a chain of islands that stretches from the South American coast to the tip of Florida. That geographical position made it one of the first points of entry for peoples moving into the Greater Antilles from the south, and also a point of convergence for different migration streams, which is part of why the archaic record on Jamaica is more complicated and more varied than the older model predicted. The site at Cow Island off the south coast of Clarendon is one of the places where the complication becomes visible. Cow Island is a small offshore cay that has produced archaic material from multiple excavation seasons. What makes the Cow Island assemblage unusual is the combination of material types present: shell tools, lithic choppers and scrapers, bone fragments from both marine and terrestrial species, and in one layer, a deposit of charcoal and burned material suggesting a hearth in a location where sustained occupation would require regular supply runs from the mainland island. An offshore cay is not where you camp by accident. You camp there because the fishing is good in that spot, because the sightlines give early warning of approaching weather or approaching people, because the cay is a waypoint in a longer coastal movement. The people who maintained a presence on Cow Island were not simply passing through. They were returning. The evidence of sustained return over time distinguishes a genuine occupation from a single episode. Archaic Jamaica shows that evidence at multiple coastal sites along the southern and western shoreline. The sites are not one-time camps. They are places people came back to across seasons and across generations. That kind of repeated, organized return is the behavior of people who know where they are and know where they can find what they need. It is the behavior of people who have made the island their own. The question archaeologists working in Jamaica have been asking for the past 3 decades is not whether the archaic peoples were there. That is settled. The question is how deep the record goes and how much of it can still be recovered. The honest answer is that the record is substantially deeper than what has been published and substantially more fragile than what has survived. The tropical environment of Jamaica is not gentle to organic material. Bone and shell and charcoal survive in caves and in the compressed anaerobic layers of deep middens. They do not survive in open contexts on a wet, acidic tropical landscape. Everything the archaic peoples left behind in contexts other than caves and middens is gone. The shelters built from perishable materials, the watercraft they arrived on, the baskets and the cordage and the organic tools that made up most of their material culture. All of it dissolved back into the ground. What survives is stone and shell and bone and the charcoal of fires. From those 4 categories, Caribbean archaeologists have reconstructed the picture of a people who were living on this island before the Mayans raised their first pyramid. There are middens on the southern coast that have been sampled but not excavated. There are cave systems in the central parishes entered but not surveyed. There are coastal shelf deposits off the south shore identified but never fully documented. And there are sites reported in the literature of the 19th and early 20th centuries that have never been relocated in the modern survey record, which may mean they were destroyed by development, or it may mean they are still there under the scrub and the cane fields, waiting for the next person who knows what to look for. The buried world beneath Jamaica is not a metaphor. It is a physical record of people who were here first, who made this island their own 4,000 years ago, and who left the evidence of their presence in stone and shell and the ash of fires that burned before anyone in the old world had heard of this island. Before the Mayans built Tikal, before the Olmec raised their first colossal head, before any civilization with a written record had put this ocean on a map. They were here. The ground still holds what they left, and most of it has never been brought up to the light. The record runs deeper than anyone has yet dug, still down there in the middens and the cave deposits and the offshore caves of a small island that the world thinks it already knows. It does not know it yet, not even close. If you want to keep following this record one site and one excavation at a time, subscribe. The Caribbean's buried history does not run short of material. It runs short of people willing to count it properly. This channel is where the counting continues.